Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to implement a login system but in a RESTful style. So basically we are going to expose all the different functionalities of registration and login system as RESTful services. As you can see over here, we have 5 buttons. The first one is for signing up new member. The second one is logging in, logging out, updating when a user wants to update the details, and this one is for when the user wants to unsubscribe from that particular service. The reason we are implementing this as a RESTful service is because this is what you will encounter in most of practical business-oriented web applications and websites. So basically, any website other than the portfolio type of websites, they usually have members registered with them, and using those members, they do the business. But since these user details are privacy critical, so it is paramount that we keep this information as secure as possible. But when we implement a login system as one monolithic service where even our front end is being rendered through the backend, such as the most of the login system examples that you see on YouTube, they have a backend language such as PHP, and that backend file does the job such as registration and everything, and then from that file the presentation logic, that is HTML, is generated and that is sent to the browser. So this practically means that every user who wants to do business through that particular website, he has to knock at the back end. That back end, after doing the business related task, will hand out the HTML or front end code to the client to take it and display it in the browser. That's practically what it means. There is nothing wrong with that either, but the problem is that we want to keep our backend more secure than our front end. We want our front end to be easily accessible and exposed so that user don't feel annoyed by different privacy checks that we apply. We want our front end to be as user friendly as possible. Whereas for the backend, we want it to be kind of hidden from the world, and only the front end of our business application should be communicating with the backend. This is what we expect from any business-oriented web application or website. And to do that, we have to segregate the front end and backend. And we want the front end to make HTTP requests to the backend and get the replies through those HTTP requests. We don't want the front end and back end intertwined into one file. And to do that, we have to implement registration and login system as a RESTful API. So this is what today we are going to implement. And to implement this project, I'm using PHP for the backend, JavaScript for the front end, and MySql server as the database server. At a text editor, I'm using Visual Studio Code Editor, and I'm going to access MySql through MySql Workbench. But before we jump into coding showing, let me give you a demo of what to expect at the end of this tutorial. So we first start with sign up service. So when I click on this sign up button, I am redirected to this register.html page, and here I have to fill in all these details and click on this subscribe button. When I click on this subscribe, behind the scenes, a fetch request gets sent to the server along with these details that we have filled in these input fields. And if everything goes right, we will get an alert on the screen notifying us of successful registration. And the moment we click on that OK button on that alert, we will be redirected back to our landing page, that is index.html. If there was some other problem and the registration was not successful, we will remain on this same page to give it another go. So let me put some random values. I'm using ZZZ for all the fields as a new member. So all the fields are ZZZ. Subscribe. And now I get this message that the registration is successful. Now the moment I click on this, I will be redirected to the landing page. Now when I click on this login, now I have to provide the same details, ZZZ. The moment I click on this login button, a HTTP request using Fetch API gets sent over to the server. And if these credentials match any of the rows in the database, then we will be successfully logged in. A session will start at the server side, and the server will also send user a cookie that is going to be passed along for every other request, because the certain operations such as updating and logging out and unsubscribe, these all require for the user to be logged in. So when a user sends a cookie along with any request, that means the user is logged in. So let me click on this login and it says welcome ZZZ. When I clicked on that OK button, I got redirected back to the landing page. Now I have three options. I can log out, update or unsubscribe. So let me log out first and let me try to unsubscribe. Now it says you are not authorized to perform this operation because I am not logged in. So let me log in again. And before I click on this unsubscribe, let me go through update. So here the currently logged in user can update his details. So from ZZZ I want to change it to CCC. Even the password and repeat passwords are CCC. So I'm keeping these details same because it's easier this way. Okay, it says record updated. Now let me log out and try to log in again with my older credentials that were CCC and see if I'm able to log in or not. So it says invalid username or password because all my credentials have been changed from CCC to CCC. Now let's give it another go with CCC. Now it says welcome CCC. Now I can unsubscribe as well. CCC is no longer a registered member. So now even if I try to log in with CCC, I won't be able to. So CCC is no more recognized as a registered member. So that was the demo of the project that we are going to build. So now let's start coding this project. But before we start coding, I would suggest you to go and check out my RESTful API video, which is around 10 minutes video. So it's not going to take a lot of your time, but it's going to make the methodology or the approach that I'm going to take to implement this project much more easier to comprehend. It's not mandatory. However, I highly recommend that you must go and watch it. Okay, so having said that, now let's start building the project. And the first thing that we are going to build is create our database. I'm using MySQL Workbench for database management. The first thing that we need to do is create a database, and in that database we are only going to need just one table called users that is going to store all the information regarding the registered users. So let's begin by creating a database. Create database, and we are going to call it RESTful_login. Now I need to execute this statement, so I'm going to click on this lightning style icon. This cross and red circle over here indicates that the execution of this statement was unsuccessful because this database with this particular name already exists. So I'm going to go for REST login. This time we got successful. Okay, once we have created this database, next we need to select this database. So let's select a database which was REST_login. Now let's execute it. If you can see over here, none of these databases are highlighted. However, since I have executed this statement, and if I refresh this, now you can see this REST_login database has been highlighted. So that means now if I create a new table, it's going to be created into this particular database. So let's start creating table, and our table's name is going to be users. Then in these parentheses we have to define all the columns. So the first one is going to be ID, which is going to be the primary key. So it's going to be of type int, unsigned, not null, auto increment, primary key. Then we need a column which is going to correspond to the first name input field in the sign up form. So I am going to call this one first underscore name, and it's varchar with 255 characters, and it must not be null. That's it. Copy, and we want similar for the last name. Then paste one more time for the username field, and username field needs to be unique as well, because based on that username and password we are going to verify a user when it wants to log in. Then again paste, but this time for email, and it should be unique as well. Now for password, and last field for repeat password. Because this is the last column, so we don't need a comma at the end, but we need to put a semicolon at the end of this create table. Now let's execute it. Now this green circle indicates that the table created successfully, and if you want to confirm that the table has been created, we have to refresh it. And now you can see this diamond over here which wasn't there before. It has this table named users. If we click over here, it should give us all the data that this users table currently have, which it doesn't because we have just created. So this was all the database. Okay, this is all that we needed to do in the database directly. The rest of the manipulation of database is going to be taking place through our back end and front end side coding that we are going to implement. Okay, so now we can finally get our hands dirty with coding shredding. I'm currently in my Visual Studio Code. As you can see, I'm currently in this folder named RESTful Login, which is an empty folder. So I'm going to create two subfolders in this folder. One is going to represent the front end and the second is going to represent the back end. So let's begin. Backend. So I'm going to implement front end of each service first and then its respective backend service. But before I do that, I have to do two parts first related to the backend. The first one is going to be the connectivity with the database part. The second one is going to be the overall structure of the main backend file, which is going to handle all the requests from the front end or the client. So let's start with the database connectivity part first. So let me create a file in the backend folder. So I'm going to call it db.php. So over here I have to define the logic for connectivity with the database server. So for the database connectivity, I'm going to go for object-oriented version of MySql. MySql comes with two flavors, both procedural as well as object-oriented. I'm going to go for object-oriented one. So the first thing that we need is we need to provide parameters that are needed for creating a connection. So I'm going to store the values of those parameters in the variables. First one is going to be the domain where our database is up and running. So the convention is to use the variable name host for that, and the value of this variable is going to be localhost 33306, which is the default port for MySQL server. Then we need database name, which I am storing in DB, and the name is rest_login. Then we need username and password, which is root in my case, and password is also root in my case. So whatever the username and password you have set for your MySQL server, you have to replace these values with your own values. Now in order to create a connection with the database server, we have to use new MySQLi, and we have to pass those variables. The first one is the host, then the database name, then user, and password comes in the end. Now this statement is going to return us a connection with the database server that we have to store in a variable. So I'm going to call it connection. Now all we need to do is we have to verify that if this connection was successful and actually there is an object stored that represents the connectivity with the database, or something went wrong. So for that we are going to check that if connection. Now because we are using OOP version of MySQL, that's why we have to use this arrow operator. This is equivalent to the dot operator in normal object-oriented programming. So this connection is an object, and we are going to call error number method. Sorry, it's connect underscore error number. If this method returns us some error number, that means the connectivity with the MySQL server didn't succeed and some sort of error occurred. In that case, we are going to display the exact error message, not the number but the message. So to get the message, we have to call another method of connection object, which is connect underscore error. So this echo is actually going to display whatever comes next on the standard output. But because in our case this standard output is going to be HTTP response, so that means it is always a good idea to set some headers for the HTTP response, because those headers are going to help the browser display the message appropriately. For example, you can set the response codes so that the browser knows if this response from the server represents a success message or a failure message. And the other thing that you can help the browser with is you can inform the browser that what kind of data you are sending in the HTTP response, such as are you sending HTML or XML or JSON objects or anything else. In our case, we are sending simple plain string, which is going to be returned by this method. So its type of data that we are sending is plain text. So I'm going to define both of these headers. First one is going to be HTTP response code. And because something went wrong, so we are going to send 400. The next thing that we need to do is inform the browser the kind of data we are sending. So for that we have to, and the particular header that we have to set is content type, which in our case are plain text. So text/plain is the value, and then we want to stop the execution right there. So therefore we are calling the exit function. That is all for the database connectivity part. Now we have to define another file over here. So I'm going to call it model.php, and this is going to be the main file. Every time a client request reaches the backend, this is the file that is going to be hit, and this is where all the RESTful services that are being offered at the front end are going to be handled. So the first thing that we have to do is put this tag. This is going to indicate that whatever we do next is going to be PHP code. The next thing that we need to do is that we have to include this database connectivity code in our model.php file, and for that we are going to use include once statement, and we have to provide the name of the file that we want to be included as part of this file model.php. We have to provide name in these quotation marks right there, because the model.php and database.php are in the same folder. I can say database.php. However, to be on the safe side, it is always good idea to put dot followed by /. So this indicates that in the current folder there is a file named db.php. Include that file in the model.php. Now, if you have watched my video on RESTful API, then you know that this model.php is going to implement all the different CRUD services that are implemented through Frontend. So let me define those functions first with empty bodies. So the first one is going to be subscribe function, and this function needs this database connectivity object, so I'm passing in connection object. Then we need another function for login. We need one function for logout, another function for update, and one function for unsubscribe. Now, because different front-end services are going to hit the same endpoint, that is model.php, we need a way to identify the kind of request that is being sent. Is it a subscribe request? Is it a login request, logout request, update, or unsubscribe request, so that we can direct that request to the relevant function for further processing. So what could be that way of identification? Well, again, you would have already guessed the answer had you watched my video. If not, then let me tell you. We used specific HTTP method with the request that is coming from the client to identify the kind of service that is being requested by the client. So let's start with subscribe. Now, because our subscription at the front end contains a form where you fill in your credentials, and those credentials are sent along with the request to the server, and we don't want that data to be displayed in the address bar in the browser. So that means we have to send that data in the body of HTTP request, because that data is very critical. We don't want it to be the part of URL. And whenever we send data in the body of the HTTP request, we have to use HTTP post method while making that request. So if $_server request method is post, then execute subscribe function and pass along that connection object. So now this $_server is one of the built-in global variables in PHP, and by these square brackets you must have already guessed that this is actually an array, and within these indices, since there isn't any numeric value, rather a string, so that means it's an associative array. So that particular element of this $_server array, which is identified through indice request method, if the contents of that particular element is post, that means we should call the subscribe function. So I'll leave out the login part for a while. Okay. Now let me handle the logout part. Now, because with logout request, you don't need to send any data along with the HTTP request. So that means we can safely use get method. If the request method is get, in that case call the logout function. So if the request method is get, which happens to be default method as well, that means if you are sending any kind of data, that data is going to be attached in the URL itself, and that means it's exposed as well. But with login, we don't need to send any data, so we can comfortably use this get request method for the logout service. Now for the update, we can use another HTTP method called page. So if the HTTP request method that is used is paged, that means the service that is being used at the front end is update service. So in that case, execute update function and pass connection object to it. And if the HTTP request method is delete, in that case the user is interested in unsubscribing. Now comes the login part. So if you think about it, with the login request, we are basically reading from the table. And with read operations in RESTful services, usually get method is used. But because we are sending very critical data along with the login request, we cannot use get request for the login service because we don't want our passwords in particular to be exposed in the URL. However, if I try to do this, that if request method is post, then call unsubscribe. Now the server is confused. The server is already making a decision to execute subscribe function if the request method is post. Now we are saying if the request method is post, call unsubscribe function. Now the server is going to get confused that which function shall I execute. So that means we have to help our web server over here and provide some more information based on which the server can make the decision whether to execute this subscribe function or to execute this unsubscribe function. So for that we are going to take advantage of the data which is sent in the body of the HTTP request. Now because the data is sent as a post method, so all the data can be accessed using another global variable called post. Let me put AND operator over here. So all the data that is coming from the client, be it subscription data or login data, that data is user specific, user's name, user's passwords, email and everything. But our front end has to send another additional piece of data along with that user data, which is going to help identify which function should handle that particular request. So we will see in the front end part how will we add that piece of data there. But for the backend, we have to assume that all the data that is coming from the client has one particular key value pair, which is called CRUD request. This is the key. If its value is subscribe, that means it's a subscription request and execute this subscribe function. And if the value of that CRUD request is login, sorry, I'm supposed to write login over here. So I kept saying that subscribe and an unsubscribe. So unsubscribe is clear. It goes with delete method. I was meant to say login function. Okay. So if the value of this CRUD request variable is login, in that case, even though the method is post, execute this login function. This is the overall skeleton of our module.php file. Before we add any more logic there, we have to go to our front end and create our front end logic first. We are starting off developing our front end from this landing page. So I need to create a file in front end folder. Boilerplate code. The first thing that we need is a heading, RESTful registration and login system. We have to make this full a subscript, so we have to enclose it in a subtag. Now we need a div with 5 buttons inside it. The caption for first button is going to be sign up. Login is second button's caption. Update is third button's caption. Log out for fourth and unsubscribe for the fifth one. Each of these also require classes so that we can access them through JavaScript. So I'm going to give all of them classes. The class for sign up is going to be sign up as well to keep the things consistent. And for this unsubscribe, I'm going to use the class name delete because this is shorter. compared to unsubscribe. Okay, let's see how it looks in the browser. So I'm opening it with live server. So this is how it currently looks. All we need to do is we have to bring these contents in the center and put some space between the top of the window and the heading, and then some space between heading and the buttons themselves, and then we have to make these buttons slightly bigger with slightly bigger text as well. And since this is minimalistic styling, so I'm going to go for internal styling. So I'm going to use the style in the head section. Let's start with heading first. To bring it to the center, we have to set its text align property to center, and we have to give it some top and bottom margins. Margin top 15 pixels, maybe 25 pixels. Now for the button, we have to set its width to 150 pixels and height to 80 pixels, and we have to set its font size to 1.2 rem. So rem is a unit, and if the value is 1 rem, it simply means whatever is the default size of that particular element. So by default, usually the font size is 16 pixels. So if I use 1 rem, it means it's going to stay the same. However, if I change it to 1.2 rem, it means 20% more. So let's see how it looks. That's reasonable. Now all we need to do is bring this in the center and put some space between the heading and the buttons. So for that, the space can be set by setting the margin top properties of buttons to, let's say, 10%. And to bring them in the center, we have to set the text align property for the div in which all these buttons are enclosed. Center. That is good enough for our purpose because our main focus is not the styling, rather the backend programming. So we are good with this one. Okay, now what we need to do is that we have to define an event listener for all of these buttons. The event listener for sign up, login and update are going to be the simple one with just one line, and which is simply going to redirect us to signup.html page, login.html page and update.html page. Whereas for logout or unsubscribe, they are going to be a bit lengthier because the event listener for these buttons are going to generate fetch requests for the server directly from the event listener. So let's get cracking. To define event listener, we have to link JavaScript file with this HTML file. And the file that I'm going to link, I'm naming it script.js file. This dot followed by slash simply means in the current folder. So this script file should be in the current folder, that is frontend.html. So let's create this file. The first thing that we need to do is we have to get a reference to all these buttons. So for that, const sign up document dot query selector, and the name that we gave to sign up button was sign up as well. So let me copy and paste 4 more times. The second one is login. Third one is update, and since these are all classes, so I have to put a dot over here. Logout, and this is going to be delete. So we are getting a reference to all these buttons using the class name because the class name is unique for each of these buttons. Once we got hold of a reference to those buttons, we can manipulate those buttons from here. So let's define a event listener for sign up, and the event listener is click, and what should happen next is going to be defined over here. So since it's one-liner event listener, which is basically going to redirect us to another HTML page, so I'm going to go for an arrow function with location.href equals current folder signup.html. So this location.href is going to redirect us to another page, which is signup.html. I'm going to copy and paste it 2 more times because we need similar logic for login and update buttons as well. Okay, none of these files exist yet. We need to create them. But before we create those files, we need to define event listeners for logout and delete as well. But they are going to have an empty body because their logic is going to be slightly longer than these, and we will define that logic when we get to that part. But let's define the event listener. So now log out and delete. They have event listener defined as well, but their bodies are empty. So nothing will happen when we click on them. Okay, now let's start with this signup.html file. Let's create signup file. Boilerplate code. Our file needs a heading, and the heading is. Next we need a form because we are sending user credentials through this form. We don't need this action though because we are going to send that data through Fetch API. Okay, so to get data from the user, we need 9 input fields. 7 of them are going to be for the user data, such as first name, last name, username, email, password, repeat password. The 8th one is going to be the hidden field because we are going to hard code data there, which is going to go along with the user data in the HTTP request, where the server is going to make decision based on that hidden field data. If the value of that hidden field data is subscribe, the subscribe function is going to be executed. If the value of that hidden field is login, the login function is going to be executed. So the name of that hidden field is going to be crud_request because this is how we are referring to it in the module.php. And the last one is going to behave like a button. When we click on it, the request is actually going to be sent to the server. And since we are going to apply a little bit of styling to each of these fields, we have to enclose each of these fields inside its own div. We also need labels for all the user fields as well. So let's start with div, and this div is going to have a label field plus an input field of type text, and we need total 9 such fields, so times 9. Now we have 9 divs with label and input fields in it. So let's start with labeling first. First name, last name. We don't need 9 fields. In fact, we only need 8 fields. So I'm deleting one of the fields. Now for the hidden field and the submit field, we don't need any labels. So let me remove it. Let's give each of these name. F name with capital N, L name, username, email, password. Let's make it shorter. Repeat password. We are going to change the type of email from text to email. This way we won't be able to enter invalid email, and we are going to change the type for password and repeat password as well from text to password. So this is going to make our text turn into circles when we type anything in those fields, and we won't be able to see what has been typed. We don't require ID, so I am going to remove them. Now for the hidden field, we have to change its type to hidden. The name is going to be CRUD request because this is the name with which the server knows and the value we have to hard code. We are not letting user see or type any value. So for the sign up form, the value that we have used in the model.php is subscribe, but let me go and change it to sign up. It's going to make it shorter. Sign up, and let me change the function name as well. Okay, so now the value is going to be sign up. For the submit button, we have to change the type to submit. We don't need name for it, only the value. So whatever we write over here is going to be displayed as a caption on the button in our form. So we are going to say sign up. Now let's see how it looks. It says cannot get frontend signup.html. So the problem is this sign up is supposed to be inside this frontend folder, but instead it is at the top level folder. So I have to move it over here. Okay, now give it another go. So this is how it currently looks. Now we have to apply a little bit of styling so that it looks bearable. So again we are going to go for internal styling. For the heading, I'm copying the styling from index.html and pasting it. To style the input fields, we have to set the display property for the div to flex and flex direction to column. So this is how it looks. Now to shrink the size of these input fields, we have to define the width for the parent of the div, because currently each flex column is occupying 100% of the div. So the parent of div is form. The width is going to be 60% of viewing width, and to bring this form in the center, we have to set its margin to auto. So now that looks better. Now we need to put some breathing space between each of these fields. So margin bottom, let's give each of them 10 pixels. 10 pixels. That's better. Now all that is left is that we need to define a event listener for this button, and then from that event listener we have to send a HTTP request to the server. So first of all we need a script file, and I'm going to call it signup.js, def as usual. Now we need to create this file, signup.js. We need a reference to the sign up button, which in fact is an input field. So this time we are interested in input field, but since there are 8 input fields, but we only want to uniquely refer to that sign up input field. So for that we have to use square brackets, and we have to provide the type of that input field. So the type is submit. Now let's define an event listener for the sign up. Now we need to send a HTTP request using Fetch API. So Fetch API is a built-in API in all the browsers. So the way to use Fetch API is fetch, and then as a first parameter we have to provide the URL, which in our case is, so this is the URL where this fetch request is going to go. And if there is any server listening on that particular URL and it has this file model.php, our request will be directed to that file. To send along data, the second argument is a JavaScript object, and in this JavaScript object we can provide data in the form of key value pairs. So the first one is method key with the value post, because we don't want this fetch request to go as a get request, because if it's a get request then all the user data is going to be displayed in the address bar. using post as a method, the user data is going to be sent along in the body of the HTTP request. Now the second piece of information that we need to send along with this request is all the data that has been entered in the form. To do that, we are creating a form data object. So over here we are creating a new form data object and storing it in our constant named form data with small f. This form data requires as a parameter a reference to the actual form from where this form data is going to grab all the data. So we need to provide that reference, and we can provide that reference by document.query selector and linking our form with this new form data object. This way, all the data that has been entered in the form is going to be stored in this form data object. Now, the second key value pair is going to be the body, and its value is going to be form data. The fetch request always returns a promise, and promise simply means that whenever I get the response back from the server, I will let you know. In the meantime, you are free to do whatever you want to do. You don't need to be stuck over here. So in that case, we have to say that, okay, whenever you get the response, this is what that should happen next. And that piece of code is defined through a then clause. So basically, whenever a promise is returned by any object, we always have to use a then clause. And this then clause is going to accept a parameter which is going to be the HTTP reply from the server. So I'm going to refer to it as res. And what am I going to do with this? I'm going to define it in the body of the arrow function. In the body of this arrow function, I want to do just two things. First, I want to get the HTTP status code, because based on that status code, I'm going to decide whether the user should be redirected to the landing page or it should stay on the same page. So for that, I need a local variable. I'm going to call it status as well. And over here in the then body, I'm going to get the status from the HTTP response and store it in the local status variable. So status is going to be response.status. Now the next thing that I want to do is that since the HTTP response contains different pieces of information, but I'm only interested in the body part of that information because that body contains the data that I'm interested in. So I'm going to call response.text function. But the problem is that this response.text function again returns a promise. So that means I need another then block, but I need to return this promise. Then I'm going to capture the second then block, whatever is returned, which is the body of the HTTP response. So when that is returned, it is captured in the second then block. So again, I need an arrow function. And this time the parameter I'm going to use is data, because I have only got the data this time. And in the body of this data, I'm going to display it as an alert. And once the OK button has been clicked on that alert, the next thing that should happen is, now I want to check what is the value of status code. So if the status is 200, that means the user got registered successfully, and now the user should redirect to the landing page so that it can use other services as well. Location.href, index.html. We also need a catch block which will only get executed if some error occurred while generating this fetch request. So I want the error message to be displayed in the alert as well. So that's all the logic for the sign up button. So let's see how it works. Since our backend does not have anything, but in order to see that the front end part is working, the fetch API request is working, it's interacting with the backend and getting the response back from the backend, we should put some text in the sign up function. Let's simply say welcome to sign up function. But our server is not running yet, so let's start our server. And to start the server, the command that I have to use is php -s localhost, then port number, and I want this backend to be the root directory of the folder, so -t and then backend / Now it says the server has started and this backend folder is the root. Okay, so let me put random data. So this is the benefit of setting the type to email, that we are not able to enter any invalid email, and something over here. Okay. So there are two issues that we need to resolve. First of all, if you look over here, even though we have set the method to post in the event listener, we are still able to see the data in the address bar. This is because when we click on this submit button, the default behavior associated with the form element is taking precedence over the event listener. So we have to disable that behavior first of all. And to do that, let's go back to signup.html, and over here we have to define on submit return false with semicolon. Now let's see if it works. Something and something. Okay, so that problem has been resolved. But where did the other problem go? Okay. So I have identified the problem. So if you read these first two lines, in particular the second line, it says the resource from this particular URL was blocked due to MIME type. So to fix this problem, we have to put just / over here. So this / means from the root folder. So now give it another go. Let's click on sign up. Now it says network error when attempting to fetch a resource. This is an error I was anticipating. It's called course error, and we are encountering this error because if we look at the address, the domain part consists of 127.0.0.1 and then the port number, which is 5501. And our server is running on again same IP address, but the port number is different. So even when the port numbers are different, it practically means these both front end and back end are completely different websites. They are up and running at two different domains and they have their own URLs. So the default behavior for the back end is that the backend is only permitted to serve the requests, HTTP requests that are being generated from its own backend. And since this front end is not being considered as part of its own backend, so this front end is an outsider for the backend. So we have to tweak the behavior of the backend so that it serves any request coming from this front end. And to tweak that behavior of the backend, we have to go into the model.php file and we have to set a header. And the header is access control allow origin, and for the time being we are setting it to asterisk. By setting this header to asterisk, we are saying you are supposed to serve any request that comes your way. You don't have to be picky about anything. Just serve it wherever the request comes from. So now let's give it another go. Okay, now this time we've got database related error in the db.php file on line number 7. So let's see what mistake we have made there. Okay, so the error is we are supposed to put this database name in the end. Okay, let's give it another go. Sign up. It says welcome to sign up function. So our front end and back end are finally working properly. Now all we need to do is we have to define the logic for our sign up function. Currently it's only displaying this string. So let's start with that. Let's go to sign up function. There it is. Okay. Now the first thing that we need to do over here is that we have to extract data from the HTTP request, which is available in one of the PHP's global variables, and it is $_post. After getting the data, we have to make sure that none of the fields are empty. If the fields are empty, then we will stop the execution of the signup function right there and send the request failure message back to the client so that the client needs to fill in all the fields. If we get past that part, then we'll verify if the email address is valid email address. If not, then again we will halt the execution of the signup function right there and we will send the response back to the client that that is not a valid email to continue. And finally, we will verify if the passwords and repeat passwords are matching. If they don't, again we'll stop the execution there with the registration failure message back to the client. And if we get past all of these, then we will hash the passwords before storing in the table so that not even the database administrator is able to see the actual password of the user. Then we will define SQL prepared statement and finally execute it. If the execution gets successful, we will send the congratulatory message to the client that the registration is successful. Now the client is the member of this particular website. So let's start extracting the data from the request and store it in our local variables. I'm choosing similar names for the data with which it has been sent over. So $fname is going to store data from $_post and fname. Password, I need one more field. Our password for repeat password. Now we need to make sure that none of these fields is empty. So for that we are going to use if empty $fname or so it means if the first name is empty, copy last name, username, email, password, repeat password. So if any of these fields is empty, in that case, we simply have to send a message that all fields are mandatory, but as we have already discussed, we need to set HTTP response code as well and then exit the function. So response codes in the range of 400 means unsuccessful. Echo the message in the quotation marks. All fields are mandatory and exit. Next we have to verify if the email address is a valid email address. For that we are going to use one of the PHP's built-in functions, which is if not filter _ bar. Now we have to pass in two parameters to this function. The first one is the data that we want to verify and second one is the kind of verification that we need. So the data that we want to verify is email address and the kind of verification that we need is filter underscore validate email. So if this filtration fails, we again have to send this response but with a different message. Paste, and the response is invalid email address. If the email address is fine as well, now we have to make sure that the password and the repeat password, both of them match. So if $pwd does not match repeat password, in that case again same response with the different text. Inconsistent passwords. Now if the passwords were consistent, next we have to get ready to store this information in our database, and for that we have to hash our password so that it's secure and protected. So the password is, we have to get this password, go through another function which is password underscore hash, and the first parameter is the password that we want to hash, and second parameter is the algorithm that we want to use for hashing this password, which is password underscore default. And since our password and repeat passwords were same, so we are going to store hashed password in the repeat password. Now this variable contains hashed value of the password, and we are assigning that value to the repeat password variable as well. Next we are going to use prepared statement for storing the data in the database, and to use a prepared statement we have to go through multiple steps. The first step of which is we need to have some SQL statement that we want to execute. So I'm going to store that statement in SQL variable, and the statement is insert into table name users. Now in the parentheses I have to provide the column names for which I want to store values. So this time we have to use the column names of the users table, which is first underscore name, last underscore name, user underscore name, email, pwd, and r underscore pwd. Then comes the values part. Now since we are going to use prepared statement, that means instead of providing the values, we have to provide some placeholders where we are going to bind those values in the later steps. So to provide those placeholders, we are going to put question marks. We have 6 column names, so 6 question marks. Then the terminator, which is semicolon for the SQL, and one more terminator for the PHP. The next step is to get an object against the connection object, and that is the object which is going to be used as the main object in the rest of these steps for executing the prepared statement. So to get an object against connection object, so we are going to use connection, and this time the method that is going to return us an initialize object is statement underscore init. And since it's returning an object, so we have to store it in some variable. Now this statement variable stores an initialize object, so that object is initialized so that further steps needed for prepared statement could be applied on that object. Okay, the next step that we need to do is that using this statement object, we have to call one of the methods on it, which is prepare. So this is preparing the object for executing a SQL statement, and since it is being prepared for executing the SQL statement, so obviously it needs a SQL statement, and we have already stored a SQL statement in this variable, so we are going to pass this variable as a parameter. The return type of this prepared statement is actually Boolean. So that means we have to use this if statement and we have to verify if the preparation went successfully or not. If the preparation failed, in that case, again copy these three statements, and this time we can say something went wrong, try again later. But if the preparation went successfully, then we are ready for the next step, which is we have to bind the values with these columns. And for that, we have to use statement, and the method that we have to use is bind underscore param, because we are binding parameters. The first parameter is always a string which is going to contain different characters based on the kind of data that we are going to bind with these columns. Since in our case all of the fields are string type and there are in total 6 columns, so we need 6 S's. Next, we have to provide the actual values, but we have to make sure if the first column in the statement is first name, the variable that we are going to bind, this should be first over here as well. So it's f name. If we write L name over here, then the last name is going to be stored as a first name in the users table. So we have to make sure that the column names and the variables that we are providing as their respective values, they match as well. The second one is L name, then the third is username, then we have email, then password, then repeat password. Now we are ready to execute this statement. So statement execute. Now since the kind of statement that we have executed is insert statement, so insert statement returns the number of rows that have been affected in response as a result of executing this statement. So that means we have to verify if the number of affected rows is greater than 0. So if the number of affected rows is not greater than 0, that means no row has been affected, and that implies the registration didn't go successfully, no data has been registered in the database. So if statement affected rows is greater than 0, in that case we are again going to copy and paste, but this time we are changing the code from 400 to 200 because this time we are sending a message of success back to the client. So congratulations, you have been successfully registered. If the number of affected rows is not greater than 0, that means again something went wrong and we should inform the user with this message. But we have to change the message slightly so that we should be able to pinpoint at which step things went wrong. Since this is the last step anyway, so there is no need to put exit over here. Okay, so that was all the logic for registering a new user. All we need to do is we have to verify that this is working and a new user can be registered through the data entered through the front-end form. So currently our users table is empty. As you can see, there is no data over here. Now let's go and register a user. So I'm going to use Q because it's quicker this way, at least for me. Sign up. It says call to undefined, bind param. So there is a spelling mistake in the bind param. There it is. Now let's try again. Q. Congratulations, you have been successfully registered and we have been redirected back to the landing page. Now let's check our users table. So refresh, and here is the details, and as you can see, the password is hashed. So that means even the database administrator is not able to figure out the password. Now let's go and see if it works. If we leave some of the fields empty, it says all fields are mandatory, and let's enter again same details but different passwords, inconsistent passwords. Okay, so that is the end of the first part of this tutorial, and in this part we have understood the logic behind implementing registration and login system as a RESTful API. In the second part we will implement the rest of these services. So see you in part 2.